Gold is the money of the people. Fiat, on the other hand, is the money of big government and quote-unquote elites. This sounds paradoxical at first because the common man, the people, look at gold and realize it's very expensive. But gold is only so expensive because fiat dollars have depreciated so badly against it. The reality? Gold just is. Gold is gold, and it has been forever. So here we have the first evidence of fiat paper money being the currency of big government and elites. Because no one would ever just accept goofy little pieces of paper in exchange for the real product of their hard work. No, we quote unquote accept fiat dollars because it's the law. Just look at each fiat note in your wallet. It's called legal tender. The government uses legal tender laws to force us to accept their money. And they do this because they know they're just going to print and devalue it whenever they need to cover their budgetary shortfalls. Furthermore, the government knows that their money printing and dollar devaluation will lead to inflation. The government never wants everyone selling off all their fiat dollars en masse, so they have legal tender laws as a legal safety net to prevent this from happening. And the quote-unquote elites who make their money directly or indirectly off big government policies, as well as rich asset and equity investors and speculators, love this fiat money printing. Why? Well, when the government prints money, they're the ones that are closest to the faucet. They scoop up all those newly printed dollars, quickly turn around and buy up assets and equities at today's prices, and then, by the time all those newly printed dollars trickle down to the poor and middle classes, leave everyone with a weaker dollar and less available stuff in the economy. On a side but related note, this process that I just described is actually what's behind the ever-widening gap between rich and poor. If today's so-called liberals and progressives really cared about the plight of the poor and middle classes, they'd aggressively push to end the Fed, which is the main facilitator of this dollar devaluation process. They would push to restore sound money backed by physical metals that can't endlessly be printed out of thin air. But alas, these aforementioned groups, today's so-called liberals and progressives, are widely misguided and or purely driven by the wicked instinct for more and more power. So they usually know, based on that instinct, that sound money would end the big government welfare statism that they love so much. After all, without big government welfare statism propped up by endlessly printable fiat paper dollars, how can these so-called liberals and progressives buy votes from the poor, desperate, and ignorant masses? How else would they be able to do that? See the problem in the conflict here? Anyways, another reason that gold is the money of the people is because it's constitutional, and the Constitution was written to protect the people from their government and the corrupt elites that are connected to it. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution clearly states that gold and silver are the only constitutionally approved monies as far as our government's concerned. Now here, critics of this idea will say that this part of the Constitution only applies to the states. However, from a strict constructionist perspective, which is the only legitimate way to interpret the Constitution, or else why would the founders bother writing it? The Constitution says nothing about the government on any level, local, state, or federal, establishing an unbacked paper currency. And nowhere did they specifically give the federal government the power to establish its own central bank. And spare me the necessary and proper argument, because all that's genuinely necessary and proper to fulfill the government's constitutional minting power, minting in the traditional sense as it was known back then, is a national mint. That's it. Nothing less, nothing more. Again, if the founders wanted us to find meaning in the Constitution, that wasn't clearly written or implied in its actual words written down in black and white, why did they even bother writing it? They could have just done nothing and proclaimed George Washington or some other esteemed individual is an absolute monarch/dictator. Put another way, why would the founders bother writing the whole Constitution if they intended for endless government growth and limitless government regulations via abuse of the necessary and proper clause? It makes zero sense. Of course, this wasn't their intention. Our founders, by and large, were heavily influenced by free market ideas. They knew that opening the door to fiat paper money would eventually result in a government-dominated society, like we increasingly have today, wherein Adam Smith's invisible hand wouldn't be able to optimally operate. Plus, our founders, who were well-read in history, knew how often previous governments engaged in currency devaluation to enrich themselves at the expense of their people's purchasing power. They did not want the same thing for our nation. A third reason why gold is the money of the people is that it's inherently deflationary. Under today's fiat paper currency, there's essentially nothing other than frail human discretion preventing the government's central bank from doubling the money supply overnight. A scary thought, really. You see, the Federal Reserve is not a free market phenomenon. Instead, it's a government-chartered and protected banking cartel which provides the government with its very own money printing press. If you or I counterfeited dollars in our garage, we'd rightfully go to jail. Yet, the government gets away with it by calling it monetary policy. Make it make sense. Oh, right, you can't because it doesn't. So, it should not surprise anyone that inflation never seems to go down. In fact, it does nothing but increase since the people in government are self-interested like the rest of us. Since the people in government are self-interested like the rest of us, they're always incentivized to overpromise and overspend our tax dollars because they know that they can just print money out of thin air and print their way out of budgetary shortfalls. Also, and sadly, they know that most people are economically ignorant. So when prices rise as a result of all the government's money printing, they safely know that they can just blame higher prices on nonsense, Marxist, socialist nonsense like quote-unquote corporate greed. Inflation should deeply concern the common man. Because as I've said before on this podcast, inflation is literally theft in taxation without representation. Again, if we the people counterfeited dollars to pay our bills every time we fell short financially, we'd go to jail. But like I said, when the government does it, they get away with it because it's called monetary policy. Gold, on the other hand, prevents this theft of your purchasing power because the government can't just print it out of thin air. So having gold as money would make government devaluation of the currency unit much, much more difficult. Since gold is inherently deflationary, imagine a restored gold standard where prices actually went down over time for a change. Oh, the horror. This is what we saw during the days of America's classical gold standard, and it could be the same again today. Imagine a world where the government can no longer endlessly print dollars to unalive thousands of innocent foreigners and our own people in unnecessary forever wars. Again, oh, the horror. Imagine a world where the government can't endlessly print dollars to fund welfare schemes that make everyone dependent on DC, kill our nation's productive motivation, and transform us over time into a socialist country. Oh, the horror. Look, when you have gold as money, and we've seen this before in history, when currency appreciates relative to goods and services, reality starts making sense again. Suddenly, people can breathe and have less anxiety because they won't have to be perpetually preoccupied with constantly making more money to keep pace with inflation. Suddenly, everyone would take more pride in their work since they know the money they're working for, gold, will gain value over time. Old school principles like saving and prudence would become sensible and useful in our society again. And we'd all finally get big government off our backs because the government's lifeline, which is worthless fiat paper money, would be cut off.